We're going to talk about the horrors we've seen on the southern border where immigrant children have been separated from their parents. And rightfully, there has been a lot of liberal condemnation of the Trump administration, which might reverse that policy. But at the same time, there isn't much historical context for why is there this immigration from Central America, which actually, it's not even at the peak. There's this impression that it's like out of control, but it's actually low compared to how it's been in the past. And also, what role has the Democratic Party played in creating this? And we can go back to Bill Clinton, but also Barack Obama, who deported more people than any other president. And of course, what are the policies that are pursued by these parties economically that are fueling a lot of this? So today we're going to talk about all of those related issues.
Yeah, the freak out is over now, but the issue, the very real issue of not just family separation, but the brutalization of immigrants by this country, and just the brutalization of the population living south of our border continues. And so, I mean, we have different issues to unpack here. I've covered immigration issues since I started out in journalism in like 2002, and I've spent a lot of time on the border. I lived in LA for 5 years, so I know a lot of the, I know a lot of the reasons why people came here from Mexico and El Salvador. I spent like almost a year off and on in Mexico, and about 6 months. Like 5 or 6 months in Nicaragua as well, which is a country that has a totally different story. And I think we have to unpack a lot of these issues. They're not obviously going to be put in context in cable media. We did see a lot on Twitter, on left Twitter, of information highlighting the role of Democrats in the crisis. And I think that's important, but it also provided Republicans with a way of saying, well, they did it too. So, you can't just blame Trump here. I think the Democrats, let me just first say that I think we've week after week since Trump has been president, there's been some kind of liberal freak out. A lot of it has been manufactured. Much of it, actually, I'd say most of it has helped move the Democratic Party and the American public in general to the right, mostly on foreign policy because of Russiagate. In this case, you had an actual issue, a very real issue being brought into the open. Basically, there was a debate within the Obama administration around 2014 about what to do with all these child migrants who were coming across the border, many of them unaccompanied. And we'll talk about why they were coming across the border in a second. The Obama administration decided, well, we'll detain them. We'll detain the shit out of them. And then we're going to send Jay Johnson and, the DHS secretary down to Guatemala to give speeches to Spanish media, warning these children and their families not to come up because we're going to send them back. Then we're going to deport all these children, including the unaccompanied minors. And Hillary Clinton did defend that policy. But they didn't decide to separate those children from their parents in custody. And the Trump administration not only made the decision to do that under Stephen Miller, who's kind of like Trump's outsourced brain on immigration and has been an anti-immigrant activist since he lived in Santa Monica and just apparently hated Latino people who were all around him there, and was at Santa Monica High School and just decided to be this kind of one of these kind of like upper middle class racist conservatives who are like the worst kind of people in our society.
You can just look at that guy. He's just a sociopath. Stephen Miller.
Yeah. But it's like a way of being a rebel when you're around liberals all the time is like, I'm going to be a racist, even though I'm basically one of them. So Stephen Miller was proud of this. He sort of he gained libidinal satisfaction from seeing images of children separated from their parents. And so the Democrats and MSDNC decided to make an issue of it for once to talk about a real issue. And it really worked because Trump's approval ratings had gone up to 45%. They fell, they did something successful. And I'd say, let's talk about, there are like 12 more crazy issues just like this. Like the Trump administration wants to triple the rent on people in low income housing because Ben Carson has said that they're too lazy and that it'll teach them a lesson. But, we're not going to go that far. In any case, it brought out the immigration crisis for everyone to see and the draconian nature of the U.S. government's handling of it, particularly ICE. ICE is just kind of like the tip of the iceberg.
And what's been very interesting and amazing to see is how there are even elements of the Democratic Party, specifically these kinds of insurgent left-wing progressives, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is likely going to be a new congresswoman in New York. Also, even Cynthia Nixon, who's running against Cuomo for governor of New York, who are running as Democrats, they and others have even called for the abolition of ICE. So it has inspired this kind of good grassroots movement on the left, although, of course, many of these mainstream Democrats are refusing to get on board with that. The impression is this is some kind of radical policy. I mean, we can talk maybe more about ICE, but ICE was created by the Bush administration after 9/11. This is actually less than 20 years old.
And it's become kind of a Praetorian political guard for Trump, which is why it's kind of it's become a soft target for people on the left. I think, calling for abolishing ICE is a good idea, but at the end of the day, it's just going to be reincorporated into something like the INS, which existed before Bush. And even some ICE agents are now coming out and saying, yeah, abolish us, and you'll just reorganize our agency.
Well, under CBP, Customs and Border Protection.
But it's just going to be a rebranding like when Blackwater became Z. And the problem will continue to fester. But it was a good way for Ocasio to distinguish herself from Crowley in a debate when he's like considered pretty progressive, but he's not really left. In any case, I think one of the things that hasn't been discussed, and it's actually given Trump a political advantage, is the context behind the immigration crisis. And it is a crisis. It's a crisis for migrants, first of all, who don't actually want to they're not here to enjoy the American way of life. They're being forced from their communities and their homes because of economic warfare, because of imperialism, because of the drug war, because of instability. And it's the fault of this country in almost every case. And that really isn't discussed. And it's what has allowed everyone from Donald Trump to like Ed Gillespie, who is this hack corporate Republican who ran for governor in Virginia, to exploit the MS-13 issue, which is also a real issue. I mean, I live in D.C. and like in the suburbs of D.C., there are people who are terrified of MS-13, but we don't talk about why MS-13 exists. And you can only understand it within the framework of empire. When you talk about MS-13, you have to understand the contras and the civil wars that took place in the 1980s. When you talk about MS-13, I would recommend everyone listening to this, watch, there's a film called Voces Inocentes, Innocent Voices. It's about the Civil War in El Salvador. It's the best film made about it. And, if you rent it, there's English subtitles. But it really shows what we did to that country through our proxy forces. We were arming the Contras and this far-right Arena party in El Salvador to carry out hundreds of thousands of killings through death squads and crush what was really I would say a nationalist insurgency oriented around socialism. To get out of the yoke of the U.S., which had just kept El Salvador as like a fruit farm for American consumers and not allowed them to develop an independent economy. Today, El Salvador exists on remittances. Much of its population lives in Washington, D.C., which is pretty ironic. They were sort of like refugees who were granted asylum in many cases. But what happened was that we created a refugee crisis by not letting them have an independent government and funding death squads. The refugees, many of them were child soldiers who had been militarized. They come to an unfamiliar environment where they're the poorest of the poor. In LA, they're poorer than Mexicans. They have to organize in their own communities. And they go to prison, becoming further militarized and hardened. And then the U.S., through the Department of Justice in the 90s, the darkest days of the Department of Justice, when the mass deportation policies really came into force under Bill Clinton, starts deporting anyone who commits a felony who's an undocumented immigrant. So people who've been inculcated into the gang culture in the U.S., who had already been militarized and traumatized by these wars, are dumped back by the thousands into El Salvador, and we destabilize that entire country all over again. That's where MS-13 comes from. Similar situation happened in Guatemala, where we and Israel armed their death squads under Efraim Rios Montt, who was a protege of Pat Robertson. He's sort of like this Christian right dictator who carried out a genocide against Mayans in Guatemala in the 80s. We deported tons of felons there. And now they have a resurgence of death squad activity in Guatemala, who are basically vigilantes who are killing gang members. And so the bodies of anyone who has like a spider tattoo, like a Mara Saltrucha type tattoo, are piling up in Guatemala City. It's another horrible situation we created. We haven't even talked about Mexico yet and what we've done to them. But once we start talking about this, then we can start pushing back on Trump's racist rhetoric on MS-13. But until we start talking about empire, there's really no way to understand them except the way that Trump wants us to, which is as animals.
Yeah, there's actually a really good article that explains some of the context for this that was published in The Nation in 2016 by Raymond Bunner, in which he's calling for the U.S. to officially apologize to El Salvador. This was after President Obama. Then he had just apologized for the U.S. support of the Dirty War in Argentina, where the U.S. backed a brutal right-wing military dictatorship. But then he looks at El Salvador and says that we need to have a similar apology. He points out that the U.S. played an active role in the Dirty War in El Salvador in the 1980s, which pitted a right-wing government against Marxist guerrillas. The U.S. sent military advisors to help the Salvadoran military fight this war, as well as hundreds of millions of dollars of economic and military aid. He points out that in Argentina, the brutal security forces killed 30,000 civilians. In El Salvador, more than 75,000 people lost their lives in the Civil War, which lasted from 1980 to 1992. And according to the United Nations Truth Commission, committed numerous atrocities, including they were responsible for more than 85% of the killings, kidnappings, and torture. So that's to say, the U.S.-backed right-wing government forces in El Salvador in the 1980s carried out 85% of the killings, kidnappings, and torture. And Raymond Bunner points out, the United States went well beyond remaining largely silent in the face of human rights abuses in El Salvador. The State Department and White House often sought to cover up the brutality to protect the perpetrators of even the most heinous crimes. He, of course, speaks about the killing of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was a well-known left-wing Catholic.
He was a liberation theology preacher, and the CIA had an active program of demolishing liberation theology because they considered it sort of crypto-communism.
Yeah, and this actually came up also when Trump demonized Latin America as a so-called hellhole. And what's interesting is this whole talking point is addressed by a very good journalist. Hopefully we can have him on our show in the future, named Oscar Martinez. And he wrote a really good book called A History of Violence, which was published by Verso. And in it, he says everything in Latin America, quote, is tangled up with the U.S. And what's so incredible is he talks about specifically this issue of gangs, which, as Max mentioned, these are not entirely indigenous groups to Latin America. He points out, this is Oscar Martinez writing in his book, A History of Violence, these gangs weren't born in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador. They came from the United States, Southern California to be precise. They began with migrants fleeing U.S.-sponsored war, and in fleeing, some of these young men found themselves living in an ecosystem of gangs already established in California, and so they came together to defend themselves, and they established a name. And then Oscar Martinez continues and he says, by the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, a few experts, member of Congress, and a president came up with a stupendous idea about how to get rid of these gangs. With the logic of an ape, they decided the problem could simply be booted to the other side of the border. They acted like a scared child who closes his eyes in the hope that what frightens him will simply disappear. And it was in these years that about 4,000 gang members, all with criminal records, were deported. They were sent to countries at war. Those 4,000 are now 60,000 just in El Salvador alone.
Yeah, it's like the reverse of the Maria Elena boat lift from Cuba that caused a giant crime wave in Miami, but like on steroids. So you just take all of these traumatized people like fireflies, put them in a jar, shake them up, and then dump them on the other side of the border and build a wall. And it wasn't Trump who started to build the wall. I mean, no one even talks about this either, or you don't hear much about how the wall started to be built. There is a wall on the border, and there have been record deaths on the border because of that wall. So we also have to talk about the U.S.-Mexico border to understand the crisis and why, and we have to talk about contemporary Central American policy, specifically Honduras, to understand the child migration crisis. But let's take it from, I guess, the 90s, following the first real amnesty for undocumented immigrants, which brought so many families and people out into the open and enabled the Mexicans especially in Los Angeles, to really start building a middle class and making LA what it really is today. And it was Ronald Reagan's amnesty. And following Reagan, and then Bush started getting more active in Latin America. He just sort of destroyed Panama. The drug war began. Delta Force was involved in the killing of Pablo Escobar, which actually caused further instability in Colombia.
And what's incredible about this story is Pablo Escobar's son actually just recently published a book in which he talked about how Pablo Escobar was working with the CIA there as well. So again, we see the U.S. fueling different sides of these conflicts and creating more and more instability, just like the Middle East.
Absolutely. You can, if you want to get granular with it, it's going to give you a headache. I mean, it's really just, it's at every layer. It's like an onion, and if you keep peeling the onion, like by the center, there's just this magma core of pure evil. But just to keep it macro, Clinton comes in the 90s, in 1992, and one of the first things he does is pass NAFTA. The New York Times published, its editorial board, of course, supported NAFTA. They support anything that's free trade. And they admitted in their editorial endorsing NAFTA that 2/3 of the country of Mexico will be badly hurt by it. That's mostly like the rural population, but also the middle class. The rural population of Mexico was devastated by NAFTA. And this is continuing a process that began under JFK called Seeds of Peace, where the U.S. would just dump all of its surplus agricultural goods and its seeds on Mexico and the global South and devastate its farm economy. And it was partly a counterinsurgency campaign because the U.S. feared that revolutionary bands would start organizing the peasantry as they did in Cuba. So they wanted to basically decimate the peasantry. So NAFTA comes in. The model is outsource U.S. jobs. The Levi Strauss plant in El Paso, which is unionized, employed mostly like a Chicana workforce, goes over the border the next day. All the union jobs you're talking about like 8,000 to 10,000 union jobs in El Paso, go to Ciudad Juarez. The first article I ever wrote was a piece from Ciudad Juarez on the mass femicides. And I visited a mass grave where 13 young girls had been found. They were sweatshop workers. They worked in the maquiladoras assembling things like Levi's jeans. And no one knew really why they were being murdered. There was just so many murders. Some were being carried out by cops, some by, deranged people, some by, drug cartels. And basically by this point, because of the killing of Escobar and the focus on Colombia, the drug shipping lines had redirected through Juarez. So there was a massive cartel in Juarez, which was actively overtaking whatever government was there and destabilizing the north, and in Tijuana. And they were fighting one another in this massive blood feud. So because of NAFTA, which forced the rural population north to these maquiladoras where there was the only economy. And because of the drug war, northern Mexico became completely destabilized, and the pressure on the border, the US-Mexico border, was enormous. There were meanwhile hundreds of deaths in places like Arizona, which is why you started to see the Minutemen and the rise of the anti-immigrant movement in Arizona, where these border vigilantes would go out. And I went out and actually reported on the first wave, the sort of first generation of border vigilantes. These people played a critical role in bringing Trump into office and putting a campaign like that on the map. But we're back in 2004. Why were these people in Arizona in the desert chasing down migrants? Because in the 90s, in the late 80s and the early 90s, most people crossed the US-Mexico border through Tijuana and through Juarez. And actually, a lot of people would, they'd just cross on rafts the Rio Grande, and some of them would go to their jobs in El Paso and come home to Juarez at night. People would go back and forth across the border, and it was just part of the culture. And, the white people who lived in El Paso and a lot of these other towns like Laredo or Brownsville didn't have that racist attitude because they just come from the culture of the border. But Bill Clinton comes in and does Operation Gatekeeper under pressure from actually his right, from right-wing Republicans who run Congress, and this movement that started in San Diego called Turn on the Lights in 1993. These racist white people from San Diego would set up their cars on the border and turn on their lights. And they were just staying there in this grassroots anti-immigrant protest until Bill Clinton agreed to build the wall. And he built the wall in Tijuana and around Tijuana. He built the wall in all of the main border cities and destroyed the culture of the border with these walls, militarized the border massively, which has led us to the rise of ICE, and forced migrants who wanted to come into the country, whether to reunite with their families, to find work, or to escape the instability that we had caused in their communities. They had to cross through the desert, which is treacherous. I mean, in the summer, you're talking about 120 degrees of heat. A lot of activists from No More Deaths in Tucson have been putting out water for them, and the water tanks and water bottles get dumped out and shot by Border Patrol agents.
Well, and some of these activists are now even being arrested.
Yeah, and they're being arrested. So the whole crisis starts then and there, and it really starts under a Democratic president. I really believe that you can draw a straight line between these policies and the rise of Trump. And these policies are an outgrowth of our whole relationship with Latin America, which goes back to the Monroe Doctrine.
And the idea that the U.S. owns the countries to its south. And throughout the Cold War, we saw just the peak of this. I mean, just the extreme violence. Max mentioned the war in Guatemala. What's interesting is in the U.S., there's this notion of American exceptionalism, but also not just that, there's this notion that American lives are more valuable, and therefore that when there's violence here, it's somehow more important than violence elsewhere. So, of course, when we saw in 9/11 the blowback of decades of the U.S. support for these far-right extremist Islamist groups and the creation of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and we saw the blowback where 3,000 innocent Americans were killed for no reason, and we're rightfully told never forget or never again. But at the same time, there were these wars that happened in the 80s and 90s where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. That's really recent. That's within our lifetimes, and there's no awareness of it, and people are just say, "Oh, forget about it, get over it." But looking at Guatemala, I mean, I was getting this up earlier when we were talking about the role the U.S. has played in destabilizing specifically Central America, where a lot of these contra wars were waged. Nicaragua is talked about, but let's look at Guatemala, where Max mentioned Rios Montt, the brutal dictator who committed genocide and was in fact facing a second genocide trial when he died recently. Rios Montt enjoyed staunch support from the U.S. and specifically the CIA during the Guatemalan Civil War, as his brutal regime just murdered and raped large numbers of communists and indigenous Guatemalans, specifically the Maya. And an independent commission that was called for by the United Nations, this is independent, not linked to a government, found that the U.S.-backed Guatemalan military regime, led by Rios Montt, was responsible for 93% of civilian killings. 93, whereas 3% were carried out by the Marxist rebels. So, again, 3% of civilians killed in this brutal 2-decade war in Guatemala were carried out by the communists, who were told were the, godless communists who don't care about civilians, whereas almost 100, or 93%, of the 42,000 civilian killings were carried out by the U.S.-backed forces. I mean, and we're supposed to, and this was in the 80s, like, people still remember this.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the U.S., it was Israel. Guatemala was directly armed by Israel, trained by Israeli soldiers. I think Rios Montt said our soldiers have adopted the Israeli way of war. I mean, he said so openly. The kind of sort of primitive computer that was exported to Guatemala, it was a computer. It was basically a database of activists and people who needed to be liquidated, was provided by Israel. The reason that the U.S., we turned to Israel, was because of the Boland Amendment, which was an amendment in the House that was passed, and it was part of intelligence reform, something that we're probably never going to have again because of the excesses and crimes committed in Vietnam, which forced, but it was also related to the Contra wars. Back then there were actually people in Congress who opposed these secret proxy wars and actually could mobilize a serious opposition. And the Boland Amendment forced the executive, the president, to put his or her signature on any secret covert activity so that they would have to take the ultimate responsibility. So they just said, okay, we don't want to put our signature on this and acknowledge it's happening. So Israel, help us out here, demonstrate why you're our friend in the Cold War.